Welcome to the BrainShape Podcast, hosted by Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, a show where we cut through the noise of the ever-growing, ever-changing world of brain health. What works and what doesn't, what's fact and what's fiction. We look at tips, tools, and techniques backed up by real scientific studies to help you keep your brain healthy and hopefully have some fun along the way. Now, here's your host, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson.
You're listening to the BrainShape Podcast, episode number 9. According to Statistics Canada, individuals aged 55 or older are among the most active of volunteers. This is exciting news because there's a lot of health benefits associated with volunteering, including better self-reported health status, less depression, and more life satisfaction. There's even evidence that shows that volunteering can impact your cognition or mental functions. Today, we're talking with Dr. Nicole Anderson, an associate professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Toronto, as well as a senior scientist at the Rotman Research Institute, Baycrest. Her research focuses on cognitive interventions for healthy older adults with mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, or adults recovering from stroke or traumatic brain injury. Dr. Anderson tells us about the research on the positive impacts that volunteering can have on your health and well-being, and shares the very insightful findings from her BRAVO study, or the Baycrest Research about Volunteering Among Older Adults study. Here we go. Here's Dr. Nicole Anderson. Hi, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hello.
I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and to talk with us about the benefits and the impact of volunteering on healthy aging. So I'm wondering if you could start by telling the listeners a little bit about your background and your research interests around aging.
Sure. Yeah, I've been studying cognitive aging since the late 80s, actually, before I started graduate school. I've always been interested in how cognition changes with age, and then I studied that throughout my PhD, and then after my PhD, I became a clinical psychologist specializing in neuropsychology. And so a lot of my research now focuses on what can we do to help prevent cognitive decline in dementia.
Interesting. So on today's episode of the BrainShape Podcast, I specifically wanted to talk to you about the work that you've done around volunteering and healthy aging. So can you start off by telling us a little bit about what is meant by the term volunteering? Like, how is it defined?
Yeah, people generally make a distinction between formal volunteering and informal volunteering. So seniors, for example, grandparents who help to babysit their grandkids, or people who help to take care of a loved one, that would be informal volunteering. And it is a form of volunteering for sure, but it is distinct from formal volunteering, where people go to a specific organization and lend their time in some way. But because of the context of it, it tends to be quite different. When people are helping out in areas of need, and it might not always be optional with informal volunteering. If you imagine taking care of a parent with dementia, yes, you're giving of your time, but it comes with a great burden as well often. Whereas formal volunteering, it's completely voluntary. You know, nobody's telling you have to go volunteer at a hospital or at a school or what have you. And so really when I'm talking about volunteering, I'm talking about formal volunteering.
And so could you tell us a little bit about the research and what do we know about the impacts of volunteering on health outcomes?
Yeah, so we did a review in 2014 where we reviewed every piece of evidence that we could find out there. So this ranged from qualitative studies where they interviewed volunteers. This included cross-sectional studies where they just compared volunteers and non-volunteers. And it included what we call prospective studies where they followed people over time and looked at how volunteers and non-volunteers change over time. And then finally, there was one randomized control trial that existed at the time, where they randomly assigned people to either volunteer in elementary schools or to not volunteer. And we put all of this evidence together to try to find what were the strongest pieces of evidence for the health benefits of volunteering in the physical, the cognitive, and the psychosocial domains. And what we found was that there was quite a lot of evidence for physical and psychosocial benefits of volunteering. So, for example, volunteers compared to non-volunteers, not only do they start out healthier and less depressed, so that is that generally speaking, people who are healthier and less depressed tend to volunteer compared to people who tend not to volunteer. But if you follow them over time, they tend to report better they self-report their health as being better. Volunteers do. They report having fewer functional limitations over time. They report less depression over time, more life satisfaction, and volunteers live longer than non-volunteers do.
Oh, wow.
So, which is, I think, a great motivation to volunteer.
Yeah, absolutely. And so can you just explain for the listeners that maybe aren't familiar with the term psychosocial and what that means?
Yeah, it's generally your well-being. So it's kind of an umbrella term that would include your levels of depression or happiness. So the latter, happiness, would refer to your general affect, your outlook on life. Under that would be life satisfaction, feelings of self-esteem, all of these things that contribute to our sense of well-being.
Right. And from the research that you are familiar with and have read, was there anything about the amount of time that's required to see these kinds of positive benefits of volunteering? Yeah.
So what the research shows is that it doesn't take much. So benefits start to emerge with as little as about 3 hours of volunteering a month.
Wow.
But what they also show is that in general, the benefits of volunteering, especially in terms of psychosocial well-being and depression, things like that, increases the more hours people volunteer, but only up to a point. And that point across studies seems to be around 100 annual hours, which works out to about 2.5, 3 hours a week of volunteering. That's when people see maximal benefits. And then beyond that, volunteering more than that, either there are no further benefits, or in a couple of cases, then you see the benefits declining again. So the 100 annual hours does seem to be kind of a sweet spot where people get the greatest benefits.
Wow. So that's pretty interesting because it suggests that it's not sort of that demanding on someone's time, because I assume and think that maybe some barriers for individuals when they think about volunteering, as they might say, I don't have the time to do that right now because there's so much going on. Maybe they're working part-time or full-time still. They're looking after their grandkids. They're hanging out with their friends. And then to know that it's actually around 100 hours a year where you see these sort of maximal benefits that 2 to 3 hours a week, it doesn't seem like it's too much for people to take on.
Right, exactly, yeah. So I think that's the best kind of take-home message, is that it doesn't take much to see these benefits.
Right. Is there a particular type of older adult that's seen in the literature to benefit the most from volunteering?
People have looked at that quote a lot. Evidence is quite mixed, but probably the one domain that has the strongest evidence is that older adults who feel appreciated or needed as a volunteer seem to have the biggest benefits in terms of, especially, again, the psychosocial outcomes, so depression and life satisfaction and general overall psychological well-being. But other than that, it's, really, there's studies here and there that find other differences. So in some cases, they found that people who had a recent negative life event, like a divorce or loss of a loved one, benefited the most, but that's like one study. So really, in our review, we tried to look for what has consistent, replicated findings, and the one thing that stood out was feeling needed and appreciated was the thing that seemed to relate to the biggest benefits.
Right. And I think on some level, everyone can sort of relate to that, right? We want to feel needed and valued and appreciated.
Especially when people are volunteering their time, right? Because they're not doing this for pay.
Yeah.
So organizations need to make sure that their volunteers feel appreciated.
Exactly. Is there any research that speaks about the impact of volunteering in the context of dementia prevention?
At the time, there wasn't a whole lot in 2014 when we wrote the review, but since then there's been a few studies, about 3 studies published that have made that link. So they've, again, they're longitudinal studies following people over time, and they find that the volunteers, when they're followed over time, tend to have less cognitive decline than non-volunteers. And of course, cognitive decline is you have the precursor or a necessary component of dementia.
Right.
They didn't look at dementia diagnosis per se in those studies, but still it's pretty strong evidence that volunteering would be reduced with lower dementia risk. But I'm not a big fan of that study because they try to say who had dementia and who didn't based on medication prescriptions from a big database. So if they were prescribed drugs like Aricept and things like that, they said they had dementia. And also it was a really young sample, average age of 67, which is not when the numbers of people with dementia really go up. So in my mind, it was a really weak study, although they did find that people who volunteered were less likely to be prescribed these medications. I personally am waiting for a more substantial study to come out to make that link.
Right. But there is sort of these seedlings of evidence that suggests there might be this link because they saw that volunteers had a slower decline in cognition over time than non-volunteers.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I'm wondering if you could tell the listeners a little bit about the work that you did. So you worked on a study called the BRAVO study, or the Baycrest Research About Volunteering Among Older Adults study. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what we did based on our review, so we ended the review with recommendations for future research, which was really a setup for our study.
Right.
But in the review, what we said was that nobody's really tried to link what makes volunteering beneficial. What are the mechanisms by which it's beneficial? And one area that we thought that people had really missed was the complexity of the volunteer work. So if I back up a little bit, there's a whole other literature showing that the complexity of our paid occupations in midlife relates to dementia risk and risk of cognitive decline in late life, such that occupations that are more cognitively complex, so you have to think harder on the job, or that are more socially complex, that you're dealing with people at higher levels in a social context, are related to better cognitive functioning and lower dementia risk in late life. And it occurred to us that volunteer jobs are like occupations in the sense that an occupational therapist would think about occupation, which is just it's a meaningful activity. And also it just made sense that volunteer jobs would vary in complexity, right? So somebody who's stuffing envelopes, that's not a very complex volunteer job, either physically or cognitively or socially. But somebody who's, say, leading exercise classes, obviously that's more physically challenging, more physically complex, and also more socially and cognitively complex because you have to come up with the routines that you're going to do, and you have to gauge people's reactions to those exercises. Are they too difficult? Do I need to adjust it? And so that's the perspective that we took. And so in our study, we recruited people who are age 55 and older, who were interested in volunteering at Baycrest, and we assessed them before they started to volunteer and at 2 6-month intervals, so after 6 months and after 12 months. And we looked at their physical and their cognitive and their psychosocial functioning as a function of how many hours did they volunteer. So we wanted to see whether there was a same sweet spot of about 100 annual hours of volunteering, but also as a function of the complexity of the volunteer roles that they held. So the physical, cognitive, and psychosocial complexity or social complexity of their volunteer roles.
And were people told what to do in their volunteering roles, or were they sort of free to choose wherever they wanted to volunteer.
Yeah, that's really important, especially from a research methodology perspective. So an ideal study would randomize people to high complex jobs and low complex jobs.
Right.
And there would be other people who are assigned to not volunteer at all for a control group or to do something else. So that would be the in terms of what we think of as gold standard research, that's what we would have done. But we didn't do that for a number of reasons.
Of course.
The main one being that, remember I talked to you about that one randomized controlled trial that seniors to volunteer in elementary schools or to not volunteer at all.
Right.
Well, not too surprisingly, a lot of people from the control group who came out wanting to volunteer and were told they can't, dropped out of the study.
Right.
Because there's like, well, forget this, I'll go volunteer somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so we were afraid of having a control group where that same thing would happen. And also we know that people who are volunteering in roles that they don't like are likely to cease volunteering too.
Yeah.
And for that reason, we did not assign people to volunteer roles. And we also let them change their volunteer roles or pick up new volunteer roles over the course of the year of volunteering as they wished. So it really was more of a study of natural volunteering. And the study design then is more like a dose response design. So when people are studying the effects of medications, they'll study the effects of very low doses, medium doses, and high doses. And in our mind, this is the same kind of thing of low dose, medium dose, high dose, in terms of the complexity of the volunteer roles that the people chose themselves.
Right.
However, I just want to say one other thing about that is that puts us in danger that the more capable people or the people who are in better health physically, cognitively, and psychosocially might have picked more complex jobs.
Right.
And fortunately, our analysis shows that I don't think that was the case. So there was no relation between people's baseline level of functioning or their age or anything like that and the complexity of the volunteer roles that they chose. So I think we're safe from that kind of what we would call a selection artifact.
Right. And what were some of the most powerful findings from the study?
So we predicted that people who would volunteer more hours would benefit more from the study, and that people who volunteered in more complex roles would benefit more from volunteering. We were a lot surprised to find that wasn't the case. First of all, the other things that we found, so we looked separately at physical functioning, psychosocial well-being, and cognitive functioning. And over the course of a year of volunteering, we didn't find any changes in physical functioning, which really isn't that surprising because when we analyzed the physical complexity of the volunteer roles that people chose, they were by and large predominantly sedentary. And that's the nature of volunteer roles in general, especially in a geriatric. And so we argue that if we want to improve people's physical functioning, we should give them opportunities that are more physically challenging in the context of their volunteer roles.
Okay.
We also didn't see any changes in psychosocial well-being over time, which stands out as different from all of the other evidence that we reviewed. Mm-hmm. But our participants were in pretty good psychosocial health to begin with, so that might have dampened the ability to see any changes in that regard. We did, however, see cognitive improvements in all of the participants, and the areas that really showed in was in terms of memory, so verbal memory and nonverbal memory and working memory, improved in general over the course of the year of volunteering, which is fabulous. But it improved more among people who volunteered fewer hours than those who volunteered more hours.
Oh.
And what's interesting with that one was that when we statistically put perceived stress into the model, mm-hmm. that went away. And what that suggests is that volunteering too many hours might be just too stressful for people to have bigger cognitive benefits.
Right.
So it might be the case, and that the point at which that happened was around this 100 annual hour mark, that people volunteering more than that had fewer cognitive benefits than people who volunteered fewer than about 100 hours in a year.
Oh, that's so interesting. So there seems to be some sort of a threshold and a sweet spot, if you think of it kind of like an inverse U, where if you hit the 100 hours, you're sort of benefiting the most, and the bottom of the U's at the top of the graph. And then if you go over those hours, it becomes potentially too stressful and too time demanding and difficult, challenging. And then you see those sort of, the U starts dropping down because it becomes a little bit too much.
Right. So that's what seems to be going on in terms of volunteer hours. But in terms of the volunteer complexity, we found that people who volunteered in less complex volunteer roles had the biggest cognitive benefits compared to people who volunteered in more complex volunteer roles.
That's interesting.
And that's not what we expected at all. And we can't, with the data that we have, we can't explain it. But, you know, there might be something here that, whereas in our paid occupations, it's important to have complex occupations in terms of dementia risk and cognitive health in late life, but maybe it's not the case that that's true in our late life volunteering. And to maintain cognitive functioning, maybe we just need a little bit of volunteering and not too complex volunteer roles to really help maintain our cognitive functioning.
Right. And I don't know if you sort of took into account the distance people had to travel. So they're, moving about space, traveling. They maybe are in an office or a space where there's social interactions. So even if the actual volunteer role itself isn't too complex, there might be sort of these complex environments that they exist within.
Yeah, we didn't do that, but we did try retrospectively to have people rate how many people they volunteered with, other volunteers, clients at Baycrest, and staff members. But because we did that retrospectively, we didn't get everybody. Right. So we can't really do that analysis because we wondered, because social complexity is very different from social quantity. So it's not that scale has nothing to do with how many people you're interacting with. It's more at the level at which you're interacting with them. So it ranges from just assisting people. So, for example, just say everybody's been to a hospital and there's an information desk with usually staffed by a volunteer. So that's a pretty low level of social interaction. It's like, where's the rheumatology department? Go down the hall, blah, blah, blah. Up to the highest level of social complexity is mentoring people and counseling people.
Right.
And so we have volunteers in palliative care, for example, and that's very much at the level of a counseling kind of role. And so that's an important distinction. Are you with a lot of people? And that's not what we're measuring here. But maybe that is the more important variable, and we just haven't captured it in our study.
Right. Well, regardless, it's a very interesting, powerful study that you conducted. And like any good research project, it illuminates future research questions that we need to address.
Right. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the idea of social capital and how it relates to volunteering and the risk of dementia?
Yeah, so this is, I think, fairly new, thinking about social capital in this context in terms of dementia risk. There's not a whole lot of people who have thought this way. The social capital is an idea that's gone back a long time, back into the 1900s, but it's really started a resurgence in the last 50, 60 years or so. And in general, it's just trying to tap into the value of social relationships in benefiting society, but also benefiting people. So if you think about people who are socially connected with other people and with society at large, they have more trust in society, and they just feel more empowered if they're connected.
Right.
And what we're starting to think is that, that might have benefits for people's cognitive health and dementia risk too. And so volunteering is one way to help people stay socially connected to their community. But there are many ways that people can get that kind of social capital, and volunteerism is one key one, but not the only way.
And so what would you say to the listeners out there who are intrigued about the idea of volunteering their time, but they don't know sort of how to get started or where to look for volunteer opportunities?
Yeah, well, there are a number of organizations out there. Volunteer Canada has a website, and that's a fabulous place to start. And I think people should just think about what is it that they want to do? What level do they want to volunteer at? So there are organizations that help place people and connect their professional area of expertise in a volunteer role. So CASO, which is I should have looked it up before, something about Canadian Executive something or the other organization. So, for example, if somebody's an accountant, they might go to Thailand and help small businesses get going or help them with their books, things like that. Other people want to help people a little bit more directly, and so volunteering at a hospital or at elementary schools or what have you. So I think people really need to reflect on what is it that they want to give and in what capacity, rather than just taking whatever volunteer opportunity first pops up. But Volunteer Canada is a fabulous place to start.
That's a great suggestion. So given the mounting evidence of the health benefits associated with volunteering, what are some changes that you think might be beneficial on a governmental or policy level to help encourage more seniors to volunteer?
Well, I think in an ideal world, there would be some kind of tax credits to offset the costs of volunteering, because there are costs associated with it in terms of transportation costs. Parking at hospitals is enormously expensive, as we all know.
Yeah.
But I think we can make changes at other levels too. So I think if organizations really reflected and thought about the value of volunteerism, and the levels at which volunteers can contribute, so that they incorporate volunteerism into the whole fabric of their organization, they would really benefit from that. And that doesn't require higher level governmental policy changes for that to happen. So we have this whole baby boomer generation retiring, and they are fabulously capable and have such rich histories and can really contribute at high levels to various organizations. So for organizations to go back and really reflect on how can we incorporate them at every level of the organization, and that would go a very, very long way. And I know we're developing a new memory model at Baycrest, and the intention is to do just that, is to incorporate volunteers at every level of planning for a new memory care model and its full implementation. So things like that, I think, would go a long way.
Yeah. And I was reading some of the stats on Statistics Canada that actually in our country, those that are over the age of 55, they're actually among the most active of the volunteer age group, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's true kind of globally, actually, that seniors tend to volunteer fewer hours, to be less likely to volunteer than younger people, probably because there's a lot more seniors who have health conditions that would prevent it from happening. But among those seniors who do volunteer, they volunteer way more hours than young people. And that's true not just in Canada, but in the United States and Europe and other places as well.
Very interesting. So what are some of the other research projects that you're currently working on?
So again, in this whole vein of trying to prevent cognitive decline and dementia, we have two studies going on that are part of the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, which is such a mouthful, I'll just call it CCNA. This is a study going on across Canada with over 450 researchers all trying to tackle issues related to dementia. And in Toronto, I'm involved in 2 non-pharmacological clinical trials where we're recruiting people who are concerned that their cognition is declining, but they haven't had any kind of diagnosis of cognitive decline. People are noticing changes and they're bothered by it, but they're still functioning very well and scoring within normal ranges. And we're enrolling them in, as I said, 2 trials. So we have one trial that's focused on this idea that social and cognitive engagement is beneficial for cognitive health and reduces dementia risk. And so in that trial, we're teaching people Spanish, or we're teaching them music, or we're getting them involved in documentary discussion groups and looking at how their cognition and brain health is maintained by doing that. In the other study, again, people who have concerns about their cognition and they have 2 or more cardiovascular risk factors. And in this case, it's an exercise and a nutrition intervention. So it's a 6-month intervention where we're going to get them really super physically fit and eating well. And again, hoping to maintain cognitive functioning and good brain health.
Wow, those are some very exciting research projects. So I wish you all the luck with recruitment and all of the work that goes into it. It sounds very exciting. I'm excited to hear the results. I mean, it won't be for many years from now, but I'm very excited about it. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Nicole, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been so fascinating to learn about the benefits of volunteering for older adults. I super appreciate your insights and the time that you took to share your knowledge with us today. If anyone's interested in learning more about the research you're currently working on, where's the best place they can go to find out more?
They can call my research assistant, and her name is Kaljani, and her phone number is 416-785-2500, extension 3315.
Wonderful. So I encourage anyone listening that's interested in being involved in these very exciting research projects to get a hold of Nicole's research assistant. So thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate it, and have a great day.
Great. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you're interested in exploring opportunities to volunteer, a good place to start is by visiting Volunteer Canada at www.volunteer.ca. To learn more about the research that Dr. Nicole Anderson is working on and to inquire about getting involved, you can call her research assistant, Kaljani Mahalingam, at 416-785-2500, extension 3315. If you've missed any of this, you can dive into the show notes for this episode and any past episodes at www.brainshape.ca/podcast. To access the show notes from today's episode specifically, just type Nicole in the search bar and Nicole's episode will pop right up, and you'll be able to listen to the audio and get all of the information that we covered today, including any links that were mentioned. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that this episode highlighted for you the incredible value that volunteering can bring to your life and your health. And if you aren't already, I truly hope that you'll consider volunteering in some capacity to share your knowledge and make a meaningful contribution to your community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you'll be notified every time we publish a new episode. And since we're a weekly show, I'll see you back here next week, where we'll be talking about sleep and how understanding the sleep system will help you make informed decisions about your sleeping habits. In the meantime, you can follow me on social media at BrainShapeTO, and be sure to let me know if there are any specific topics that you want me to cover on the podcast. Until next time, keep your brain in shape. And as always, I've had such a great time hanging out with you.